Imagine waking before sunrise, not to prepare for another ordinary day, but to collect the dead from the narrow streets of a medieval town. Your cart is already waiting outside, its wooden wheels stained from yesterday's work, while the cold morning air carries the smell of smoke, mud, and decay. You have no fine clothes, no respected position, and no place among the people who live comfortably behind their stone walls. When sickness spreads through the town, your work never seems to end. Every knock on a door may reveal another body. Every journey through the streets, another family that has lost someone they love. You lift the dead, place them onto your cart, and continue through streets where people step aside and refuse to meet your eyes. Children whisper about you, adults avoid you, and even those who desperately need your service fear coming too close. Yet someone has to carry the bodies away. Someone has to enter the houses where others are too frightened to go. And someone has to keep moving when the rest of the town is desperately trying to pretend that death is not everywhere. This is the miserable life of a medieval corpse transporter. Long before the streets of the medieval town began to fill with merchants, craftsmen, animals, and travelers, you were already awake. There was no bell calling you to a respectable trade, no warm kitchen waiting for you, and no family eager to hear about your day. Instead, you stepped outside into the cold darkness and looked toward the wooden cart that had become the center of your miserable existence. Its wheels were uneven, its boards were old, and despite being washed whenever possible, the smell of death never completely disappeared. You had learned to recognize that smell before you even reached a house. In winter, the cold slowed everything down, but in the warmer months, the work became much worse. Bodies could begin to change quickly, especially when sickness had already taken hold of a town. Your job was simple in the eyes of everyone else: collect the dead and carry them away. But there was nothing simple about doing it. You had to enter homes where families were still mourning, sometimes finding a body lying beneath a blanket while relatives stood nearby in silence. Sometimes they could afford a proper burial, and sometimes they could not. Some families would beg you to wait until another relative arrived. Others simply wanted the body removed as quickly as possible because they were frightened of disease. You were expected to remain calm through all of it. You could not show disgust, fear, or hesitation. The dead did not care whether you were tired, and the living rarely cared whether you were afraid. As you pushed your cart through the narrow streets, people noticed you immediately. Some crossed to the other side of the road. Others pulled their children away and covered their noses even when the smell was barely noticeable. You understood why they avoided you, but understanding did not make it easier. You were a necessary man, yet nobody wanted to be associated with you. The same people who needed you when someone died could look at you with suspicion the following morning. Your clothing slowly absorbed the smells of your work, and no amount of washing seemed to completely remove them. Even your hands became a reminder of what you did. There were days when you carried only one body, and there were days when the cart was filled before noon. When disease spread through the town, you could hardly keep up. Doors that once opened reluctantly began opening with desperation. Families no longer had time to grieve properly because there were too many bodies and too few people willing to handle them. You would push the cart onward through streets that seemed quieter every day, listening to the sound of your own footsteps and the wooden wheels turning beneath you. Somewhere behind every closed door was another family hoping that death would pass them by. And you knew better than most that it often did not. By the time the sun finally rose above the rooftops, you might already have carried several people away from their homes. Yet your day was only beginning. There were more streets to visit, more houses to enter, and more bodies waiting for someone willing to touch them. You were not a knight, a merchant, or a nobleman. You carried no sword and possessed no wealth. You were simply the man who arrived when everyone else stepped back. And in a medieval town surrounded by sickness, poverty, and death, that could be one of the loneliest jobs of all. The first real journey of your day usually began before the town had properly awakened. The streets were still dark, and the houses stood quietly behind wooden doors and narrow windows, while the sound of your cart seemed strangely loud against the sleeping town. You already knew which streets you needed to visit, because death had a way of creating its own map. One house might have lost an old man after a long illness. Another might have lost a child during the night, and somewhere farther away there could be a family desperately waiting for you to arrive. You stopped outside the first house and listened for a moment before knocking. Sometimes nobody answered immediately. You would knock again, and eventually a tired voice would respond from inside. The door would open only slightly, and a frightened face would appear in the darkness. You did not need to ask why you had been called. The expression on the person's face told you everything. Inside, the house was usually cold and poorly lit. A small candle might be burning beside the body, and relatives would stand nearby in silence. You had learned not to speak too much in these moments. There was little comfort you could offer, and your presence itself reminded the family that their loved one was truly gone. You would carefully prepare the body for transport, wrapping it in whatever cloth the family could spare. Wealthier households might have a proper shroud, while poorer families sometimes had almost nothing. You lifted the body with as much care as you could manage, but after doing this work for years, your movements had become practical rather than emotional. You had to think about your back, your hands, the narrow doorways, and the uneven streets outside. Once the body was placed onto the cart, you would step back and give the family a final moment. Sometimes they would pray. Sometimes they would cry. Sometimes they would simply stare at the cart without saying anything. Then you would take the handles and leave. The hardest part was often the silence behind you. As you pushed the cart away, you could hear a family beginning to mourn inside the house, while outside the town continued its ordinary life. A baker opened his shop. A merchant prepared his goods. Children began running through the streets. People bought bread and vegetables as if nothing had happened. But you knew that another household had just been changed forever. At the next corner, someone would see your cart and immediately recognize what it meant. A few people would move aside. Others would lower their heads. Some might make a religious gesture as you passed, hoping that death would not notice them next. You continued toward the next house, because there was no time to think about what people thought of you. Your work depended on movement. The longer a body remained inside a crowded home, the greater the fear of sickness became. During ordinary weeks, you might finish your collection before midday. But when illness began spreading, the number of calls could become impossible to manage. You could return to your cart and find another message waiting for you, another family asking for help, another body that needed to be taken away. Slowly, the weight on your cart increased, and so did the weight in your mind. By late morning, your hands were aching from the wooden handles. Your clothes carried the familiar smell of the dead, and you already knew that you would probably be working until sunset. Yet the town was only beginning its day, and for you, every new house could bring another body, another grieving family, and another reminder that in medieval life, death was never far away. By the time the sun climbed above the rooftops, the town had become busy, but you could feel that something was different. On ordinary mornings, the streets would already be crowded with merchants shouting about their goods, craftsmen carrying tools toward their workshops, and children running between the stalls. But when sickness began to spread, those familiar sounds slowly disappeared. People became quieter. Doors stayed closed. Windows remained shut even when the weather was warm. The streets that once felt crowded began to feel strangely empty, and you knew exactly why. Your cart moved slowly over the uneven stones, its wooden wheels making a dull rhythm that seemed to announce your arrival before you even reached the next house. You had become a familiar sight, and that was not something you were proud of. People recognized you from a distance. Some turned away immediately, while others stopped whatever they were doing and watched silently until you passed. You could not blame them. To most people, your cart meant that someone had died, and during an outbreak, it could mean that death had entered an entire neighborhood. You stopped at another house near the edge of town. A man was waiting outside, pale and exhausted, his clothes covered in mud from having spent the night caring for his family. He told you that his wife had died before dawn. Behind him, you could hear someone crying. You entered the house and immediately felt the heavy stillness inside. There was no celebration, no conversation, no ordinary noise, only the quiet breathing of those who remained. You had seen this scene many times, but somehow it never became completely ordinary. The dead woman was lying beneath a simple blanket. Her husband stood beside her, unable to decide whether he wanted you to take her away or remain there a little longer. You understood that hesitation. Once the body left the house, the finality of death became impossible to ignore. Eventually, he stepped aside. You did what you had come to do, lifted the body, and carried it outside. The husband followed you to the door but stopped before reaching the street. He watched as you placed his wife onto the cart, then slowly disappeared back inside. You continued alone. As the day went on, the number of bodies increased. You began to recognize patterns. Certain neighborhoods were suffering more than others, especially the crowded areas where families lived close together and waste filled the streets. One death could quickly become two, then three, then an entire household. You heard rumors everywhere you went. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed outsiders, foreigners, animals, or even supernatural forces. Nobody truly understood why some people became sick while others survived. You were not a physician, so you had no answers. You simply saw the consequences. You saw healthy people become weak within days. You saw families disappear from their homes. You saw streets where every other door seemed to carry the same tragedy. And every time you returned with your cart, you felt the town becoming more afraid of you. It was not because they believed you caused the deaths. It was because you had become their reminder of them. The baker could sell bread. The blacksmith could repair tools. The merchant could make money. But you carried away the evidence that the town was losing its people. By afternoon, your shoulders burned from the work, and the cart felt heavier with every turn. You wanted to stop, but there was nowhere to rest. The dead were still waiting, and the living were still calling. So you kept pushing through the silent streets, listening to the wheels roll over the stones. Behind every closed door there might be another family praying that you would not come. And somewhere else, another family was already waiting for you to arrive. By the middle of the afternoon, the wooden handles of the cart had begun to hurt your hands. You had wrapped pieces of cloth around them many times, trying to protect your palms, but the rough would always found a way through. Your shoulders ached, your back felt stiff, and your legs were tired from walking over the uneven streets since before sunrise. Yet, the physical exhaustion was only one part of the job. The heavier burden was knowing that every time you stopped, you would probably have to enter another house and carry someone else out. The cart itself had become a strange symbol in the town. When people saw it approaching, conversations stopped. Shopkeepers stepped away from the road. Mothers pulled their children closer. Some people crossed themselves or whispered prayers as you passed. You had become so familiar with this reaction that you barely noticed it anymore. What you noticed was the silence. A town that had once been full of noise could become strangely quiet when disease was spreading. You pushed the cart through a narrow street where several houses stood almost against each other. The smell of smoke and waste hung in the air, mixed with the odor coming from the cart behind you. You stopped outside a small house and knocked. There was no answer. You knocked again. Still nothing. For a moment, you wondered whether everyone inside had already died. Then you heard movement. A young boy opened the door. He looked at you without saying anything. His face was pale, and his eyes were red from crying. You asked where his family was, and he pointed toward the back room. Inside, you found an old woman lying motionless beneath a blanket. The boy told you that she had been sick for several days. There was nobody else left in the house who could take care of her. You had seen this before. Sometimes entire families became too weak to help one another, and the person who remained alive might be too young, too old, or simply too frightened to understand what to do. You carefully lifted the woman and carried her outside. The boy followed you, holding the edge of his coat. When you placed her on the cart, he stood there silently. He had no money to offer you, and you did not ask for any. You simply told him to stay away from the body and to find someone who could help him. Then you left. As you continued down the street, you began thinking about how quickly a person's life could disappear. The woman had once been someone's daughter, someone's wife, perhaps someone's mother. She had lived in that house for years, and now everything she owned would remain behind while you carried her away on a wooden cart. You had become accustomed to this reality, but you never became completely comfortable with it. The hardest moments were not always the bodies themselves. Sometimes it was seeing the empty rooms afterward. A chair left beside a table. A cup that would never be used again. A child's toy lying on the floor. Small things that reminded you that the dead had once been ordinary people with ordinary lives. But there was no time to stay and think about them. The sun was already beginning to move toward the horizon, and your work was far from finished. You pushed the cart onward, feeling every bump through the wooden handles. The load behind you grew heavier, and the road ahead seemed longer with every step. You knew that before the day ended, you would have to deliver the bodies to the place where they would be buried or prepared for burial. But first, there were still more houses to visit, more doors to knock on, more families waiting in fear. And as the afternoon light faded over the rooftops, you began to realize that the worst part of your day had not yet arrived. By late afternoon, your work had reached the point where exhaustion no longer mattered. Your hands were sore, your shoulders were stiff, and every step seemed heavier than the one before it. But the calls kept coming. A messenger found you near the edge of the market and told you that another household needed help. Before you could even finish unloading the cart, another person approached with the same request. Someone had died, then someone else. The news traveled through the town faster than you could move through its streets. You began to understand that this was what an outbreak truly looked like. It was not one dramatic moment when everyone suddenly realized they were in danger. It was a slow collapse, house by house, family by family. You returned to the cart and continued. At the next home, an elderly man was waiting outside. He did not want to let you in at first. He kept saying that his son was only sleeping and that he might recover. You had heard those words before. You did not argue with him. You simply waited until he finally stepped aside. Inside, The room was dark and smelled of sickness. His son lay motionless on a thin bed. The father stood beside him for several minutes, refusing to accept what he already knew. Eventually, he covered his son's face and stepped away. You lifted the body and carried it outside. The old man followed you to the door, but he could not bring himself to watch you place his son onto the cart. He turned away instead. You wished there was something you could say, but there was not. Your job had taught you that there were moments when words only made grief heavier. So you continued. As evening approached, the streets became even quieter. The market stalls were closing early. Shutters were being pulled across windows, and people hurried home before darkness. You were still moving in the opposite direction. While everyone else wanted to be behind a locked door, you had to keep knocking on them. At one house, nobody answered. At another, a woman begged you not to take her husband yet. She said she needed another night with him. You understood her, but you also knew that leaving a body inside a crowded home could place everyone else at greater risk. She finally agreed, crying as you carried him away. Moments like that stayed with you. You could forget a street, a name, even the number of bodies you had collected in a single day, but you remembered the faces of people who begged you to wait. By now, the cart had become difficult to push. The weight pressed down on the old wooden wheels, and every uneven stone made the entire load shift behind you. You had to stop several times just to catch your breath. Nobody offered to help. Most people did not want to come near the cart, and you had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. You were alone with your work. Eventually, you reached the final house on your list. You knocked and waited. A woman opened the door with a candle in her hand. Her husband had died during the previous night, and she had been too frightened to call anyone until now. You entered quietly. There was a small child sleeping in the corner, unaware of what had happened. You looked at the child for a moment before turning back toward the body. You had carried hundreds of people by then, but somehow the sight of a child sleeping beside a dead parent still made you pause. You completed your work and returned to the street. The sky was beginning to darken, and the first lights appeared behind the windows. Other people were preparing their evening meals. You were still pushing a cart filled with the dead toward the outskirts of town. The day had taken almost everything from you, but you knew you were not finished. The bodies still had to be delivered. They still had to be counted, prepared, and buried. And somewhere beyond the town walls, in the darkness ahead, another part of your miserable job was waiting. The last light of the day was disappearing behind the rooftops when you finally left the crowded streets behind. Your cart moved slowly toward the outskirts of town, where the houses became fewer and the roads turned into dirt. Behind you, the familiar sounds of the town faded away. No merchants shouted from their stalls, no craftsmen worked beside their doors, and no children ran through the streets. There was only the creaking of the cart and the steady sound of your footsteps. This was the part of the journey you preferred, even though it was the loneliest. Nobody followed you here unless they had a reason. The people of the town wanted the dead gone, but they did not want to know where you took them. They preferred to imagine that once a body disappeared beyond the walls, the problem disappeared with it. You knew better. At the edge of the settlement stood the burial grounds, surrounded by rough wooden fences and old graves. On ordinary days, the place might have been quiet and peaceful. During an outbreak, it could become almost impossible to recognize. Fresh earth covered older graves. Wooden markers stood at strange angles, and shallow pits waited for the next bodies. You stopped the cart and looked toward the small group of workers who were waiting for you. They had already spent hours preparing the ground. Their clothes were covered in dirt, and their faces showed the same exhaustion that you felt in your own body. Nobody spoke much. There was little reason to. Everyone already knew what had to be done. You began unloading the bodies one by one. After carrying them through the streets, this should have felt like the end of your day, but it was not. Each body still had to be handled carefully, and during periods of disease, people were often afraid to come close. You had to work quickly while trying not to damage the simple cloth coverings that protected the bodies. Sometimes relatives arrived at the burial grounds to say a final prayer. Other times nobody came at all. Those were the moments that felt strangely empty. You would place a body down and realize that nobody was waiting for it. No crying family, no final words, no one to remember the person's name. Just another silent arrival in a place that was becoming crowded with the dead. As the evening became darker, you could see small lights moving in the distance. They were lanterns carried by people returning home. You wondered how many of them would still be there in a few days. That thought had become impossible to escape. Every time you looked at a group of people, you imagined which houses you might visit tomorrow. You had started to understand that death did not only take people. It changed the way the living looked at one another. Friends avoided each other. Neighbors stopped visiting. Families kept sick relatives hidden because they feared being separated from them. And people like you became necessary because fear had made ordinary tasks almost impossible. When the last body was unloaded, you stood beside the empty cart for a moment. Your back hurt, your hands were trembling, and your clothes smelled of the work you had spent the entire day doing. You wanted to sit down, but there was still the journey back. The town gates would soon close for the night, and you had to return before they did. So you took hold of the handles once again and started walking. The road back seemed longer than before. Behind you were the graves. Ahead of you were the dark streets of the town. You knew that tomorrow morning, the cart would still be waiting outside your home. And if the sickness continued spreading, it might be even fuller than it had been today. For everyone else, the day was ending. For you, it was simply another day survived, and another day waiting to begin. When you finally reached the town gates, the sky had become completely dark. The guards recognized you immediately and opened the gate without asking many questions. They had seen your cart countless times, and even they preferred not to stand too close to it. You pushed through the narrow entrance and entered streets that were almost empty. A few candles burned behind wooden shutters, and somewhere in the distance you could hear a dog barking. Most people were already inside their homes, trying to convince themselves that the danger was outside their doors. You knew that it was not. You had spent the entire day entering those doors. You had seen what was happening behind them, and the memories followed you as you walked. Your first thought was to go home, but there was still one final task. The cart had to be cleaned. You could not simply leave it outside and walk away. The next morning, you would need it again, and anything left on the wooden boards could become a danger to you and to anyone who came near. You carried buckets of water and began washing the cart beneath the weak light of a lantern. The water quickly became dirty. You poured it away and started again. Your hands were already sore, but you kept scrubbing the boards, the handles, and the wheels. There was no one waiting to help you. People considered your work necessary, but they did not want to share any part of it. That was the strange price of your job. The town depended on you, yet you were still treated as someone who should remain at a distance. You could carry the dead through every street, but you were rarely invited into the homes of the living. You could help families during the worst moment of their lives, yet they might avoid you when they saw you in the market. Even your neighbors were careful. Some believed that simply standing too close to you could bring sickness. Others whispered that people who worked around the dead were somehow changed by them. You knew none of it was true, but fear did not need truth. It only needed a reason. After cleaning the cart, you finally returned home. Your room was small and cold, with barely enough space for a bed, a table, and a few personal belongings. You removed your outer clothing and left it away from the bed. Then you washed your hands again and again, trying to remove the smell that seemed to have become part of your skin. You sat down for a moment and listened to the silence. For the first time all day, nobody was calling your name. Nobody was knocking on your door. Nobody needed you. But instead of feeling relieved, you felt uneasy. You knew that tomorrow would bring more work. Perhaps the sickness would finally begin to disappear. Perhaps fewer doors would open when you arrived. But deep inside, you already knew that things were getting worse. The number of bodies had increased every day, and the streets were becoming emptier. You had started to wonder how long the town could continue like this. You also began to wonder how long you could continue. Your body was becoming weaker from the endless lifting and walking. Your hands were covered with small cuts, your back hurt constantly, and sleep never felt long enough. Yet there was no easy way to leave. If you stopped working, who would replace you? The town needed someone to carry the dead, but nobody wanted to become that person. You were trapped by the same thing that made your position important. Your work was hated because it was necessary. And while you sat alone in your small room, listening to the distant church bell announce the late hour, you realized something uncomfortable. The town might fear the disease, but you had begun to fear the town itself. Every knock on your door could bring another body. Every morning could begin with another street filled with silence. And tomorrow you would have to wake up and push the same cart once again. The next morning, you woke before the church bells had finished ringing. For a few moments, you remained still beneath the thin blanket, hoping that the silence outside meant there were no new calls. Then came the knock. One slow knock against the wooden door, followed by another. You already knew what it meant. You dressed quickly and stepped outside, but the person waiting there was not a stranger. It was a neighbor, a man you had spoken to many times before the sickness reached the town. His face was pale, and he would not look directly at you. He told you that someone in his household had died during the night. You followed him through the narrow streets, but something felt different. You had become so used to entering other people's homes that you had almost forgotten what it felt like when death came close to your own life. Inside the house, you found a woman lying in a small room while her family stood around her. They were frightened, but there was another problem. One of the children was coughing. You immediately understood what that could mean. The family did not want to hear it. They insisted that the child was simply tired, that the sickness would pass, that everything would be fine. You had heard those words too many times. You carefully prepared the woman's body and carried her outside. But as you placed her onto the cart, you noticed the child standing in the doorway. The child watched you silently, holding a small piece of cloth in one hand. You had no idea whether that child would still be standing there a week later. You pushed the cart away and tried not to think about it. But the thought followed you. For the first time, you began to wonder whether your work was protecting people or simply bringing the disease closer to you. Every house you entered could be infected. Every body you touched could carry something you could not see. You had spent so many days worrying about the dead that you had almost forgotten that you were alive. That realization changed the way you worked. You began washing your hands more often. You avoided touching your face. You kept your distance from people whenever you could. But there was only so much you could do. Medieval medicine offered you little protection, and the people around you often knew even less. Some believed that strong smells could keep disease away. Others carried herbs, burned fragrant materials, or prayed for protection. You tried some of these things yourself because fear makes even sensible people desperate. But no matter what you did, you still had to enter the houses. By midday, you had already collected several bodies. The streets were becoming so quiet that you could hear your cart from far away. Then you noticed something that frightened you more than the empty streets. One of the houses on your own street had closed its shutters. A small mark had been placed beside the door, warning others that sickness was inside. You stopped walking. That was your neighborhood. Your home was only a short distance away. You suddenly imagined your own room, your own bed, and the clothes you had left there. You wondered whether the sickness had already reached your doorstep. For the first time, the cart in front of you no longer felt like a tool. Felt like a warning. You had spent weeks carrying death away from other people's homes, but now you understood that you could not carry it away forever. Eventually, it might come looking for you. And as you stood in the empty street, listening to the wind moving between the buildings, you realized that the most terrifying part of your job was no longer carrying the dead. It was wondering whether you would soon become one of them. The fear that you had tried to ignore now followed you everywhere. Every cough you heard made you turn your head. Every headache made you wonder whether the sickness had finally found you. You continued working because there was no other choice, but the confidence you once had was gone. Before, you could enter a house, lift a body, and leave without thinking too much about your own safety. Now, every doorway felt like a gamble. You would stand outside for a moment before entering, listening to the silence beyond the door and wondering what you would find inside. Sometimes you wished that someone else could take your place, even though you knew there was almost nobody willing to do it. The town had begun to lose people so quickly that ordinary workers were disappearing from their jobs. Bakers stopped opening their ovens. Craftsmen abandoned their workshops. Merchants closed their stalls. Even some guards had become sick or left the town. You were one of the few people still moving from house to house. The irony was impossible to miss. While everyone else tried to avoid the sick and the dead, your work forced you toward them. You became more careful with every body you carried. You wrapped your hands when you could, kept cloth over your mouth when the smell became too strong, and washed yourself whenever there was enough water. But there was no perfect protection. You knew that. One afternoon, you arrived at a house where 3 people had already died. The surviving family members stood outside, too frightened to enter the room again. You stepped inside alone. The room was dark, and the air felt heavy. There were 2 bodies lying on the floor and another near the bed. For a moment, you simply stood there. 3 people had lived in that room only a few days earlier. Now the house was almost silent. You began your work slowly. You lifted the first body, carried it outside, returned for the second, and then the third. By the time you finished, your arms were shaking. The family member thanked you quietly, but you could barely answer. You were thinking about how easily the same scene could happen in your own home. On the way back, you passed the market. It was almost empty. A few stalls remained open, but the merchants were standing far apart from one another. Nobody wanted to touch the same objects. Nobody wanted to stand too close. Even coins were being handled with suspicion. The town no longer felt like the place you had known. It felt like a collection of frightened people waiting for something they could not see. Then you heard the church bell. It rang once, twice, then again. You stopped and counted the sound. Another funeral, perhaps several. You had learned that the bells were no longer simply announcing prayers or marking the hours. They had become part of the rhythm of the outbreak. Every ring reminded you that another person had been lost. By evening, you were back at the burial grounds. The number of fresh graves had increased again. There were so many that the workers struggled to keep track of them. Some graves had simple wooden markers. Others had nothing at all. You stood there in the fading light and realized that names were disappearing along with people. The town was losing not only its citizens, but its memories. You wondered how many of the people you had carried away would eventually be forgotten. Then you noticed something that made your stomach tighten. One of the workers near the graves was coughing. He tried to hide it, turning his head away and covering his mouth. You stared at him for a moment. He looked back at you, and neither of you said anything. You both understood what the cough might mean. You returned home that night with a strange feeling in your chest. It was not quite pain, but it was enough to make you nervous. You sat on the edge of your bed and listened to your own breathing. For the first time, you wondered whether tomorrow you would still be strong enough to push the cart. And if you were not, who would come to collect you? The next morning, you woke to a strange heaviness in your body. Your head hurt, your throat felt dry, and every movement seemed slower than usual. You sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes, staring at the floor and trying to convince yourself that it was only exhaustion. You had worked too many long days, slept too little, and eaten barely enough to keep yourself moving. Surely that was all it was. But when you stood up, your legs felt weak. You reached for the wall to steady yourself. Outside, the town was already beginning to wake, and you could hear the familiar sound of someone knocking on a distant door. Normally, you would have taken the cart and started working immediately. That morning, you hesitated. For the first time since you had taken the job, you wondered if you should simply stay inside. But then another knock came at your door. A messenger had arrived. There were more bodies waiting. You closed your eyes, took a breath, and stepped outside. The cold air felt good against your face, but it did not remove the weakness. You pushed the cart toward the first house, moving much more slowly than usual. Along the way, you noticed people watching you. Some seemed surprised that you were still working. Others looked away. You had become a familiar part of the town's suffering, almost like the church bells or the empty market stalls. At the first house, you entered and found an elderly woman waiting beside the body of her husband. She thanked you for coming, but when you tried to lift him, your arms trembled. You had to stop for a moment and catch your breath. The woman noticed. She asked whether you were sick. You told her that you were simply tired. It was easier than admitting the truth. You carried the body outside and continued. The second house was worse. 2 people had died during the night, and another was lying sick in the corner. You stood at the doorway longer than usual. Every instinct told you to leave, but you had seen what happened when bodies remained inside crowded homes. So you entered. You worked carefully, trying not to breathe too deeply, but your head began to spin. By the time you returned to the street, the sunlight seemed strangely bright. You placed both hands on the cart and waited. For several moments, you could not move. The cart stood still beneath you. This was the first time you had ever been afraid that your own body might simply stop working. You looked down at your hands. They were shaking. You considered turning around and going home, but then you heard someone calling from another house. Another death, another family, another request for you. You pushed forward. The journey became slower and harder with every street. You had to stop frequently, sometimes pretending to adjust the cart while secretly trying to regain your strength. By midday, you were sweating despite the cold air. Your head felt heavy, and the streets seemed to move around you. You finally reached the burial grounds and unloaded the bodies, but when you turned to leave, your legs gave way. You fell beside the cart. For a moment, you simply lay there in the dirt, staring at the gray sky. Nobody rushed to help you. The workers nearby kept their distance, afraid that whatever had made you weak might be contagious. Eventually, one of them approached carefully and helped you sit up. He looked at your face and immediately understood. He told you that you should go home. You wanted to argue, but you had no strength left. You pushed the empty cart back toward town, leaning heavily against it as you walked. The streets seemed longer than ever. When you finally reached your home, you barely had enough strength to open the door. You left the cart outside and collapsed onto your bed. For the first time in months, the cart stood completely still. No bodies waited on it. No families were calling. No one was asking you to hurry. But the silence was not comforting. It was frightening, because if you were sick, there was one terrible question you could not escape. Who would carry you away when your own time came? For the first time in months, the cart remained outside your door while you remained in bed. The morning passed without you hearing the sound of its wooden wheels moving through the streets. You were too weak to stand, and every attempt to get up left you dizzy. Outside, the town continued to suffer without you. At first, you thought someone would come to take over the work. Surely the authorities understood that the dead still needed to be collected. But as the hours passed, nobody came. You slowly realized the cruel truth about your position. The town needed your work desperately, but almost nobody wanted to become you. By midday, you heard voices outside. A local official had arrived with two men. They stood several steps away from your door and spoke quietly. One of them had agreed to help with the bodies, but he looked terrified. He had never done the work before. You listened as they discussed which streets had the most deaths and how many bodies were waiting. Their voices sounded distant, almost like they belonged to another world. You wanted to tell them how to handle the cart, where to take the bodies, and which families had already lost someone. But even speaking felt exhausting. Eventually, the men left. You remained alone again. That afternoon, you heard the cart moving for the first time without you. The sound was unmistakable. The wheels rolled unevenly over the stones, just as they always had. But something about hearing them from your bed felt wrong. Someone else was pushing it now. You wondered who was standing behind those handles. Perhaps a young laborer who had been promised money. Perhaps a desperate man with nowhere else to work. Whoever he was, you knew exactly what he was about to discover. The people would avoid him. The houses would open reluctantly. Families would cry when he arrived. And after a few days, his hands would probably ache just as yours did. You closed your eyes and tried to sleep, but the sound of the cart kept returning in your mind. You remembered your first day in the job, when you had been afraid of touching the dead. You remembered how people had looked at you with disgust. You remembered the first family that thanked you. You remembered the streets, the burial grounds, the endless knocks on wooden doors. For a moment, you wondered whether any of it had mattered. Then you thought about the families who had been able to say goodbye because you had arrived. You thought about the children who had been moved away from infected rooms. You thought about the people who could not bear to carry their own relatives and had trusted you to do it. Perhaps your work had never been respected, but it had been necessary. That realization brought you a strange kind of peace. You had spent so long believing that your job made you worthless because everyone avoided you. But maybe being unwanted and being useless were not the same thing. Outside, the church bells began ringing again. You counted them quietly. Another death, perhaps another funeral, perhaps another house waiting for the cart. You wondered whether you would recover enough to return to work. Part of you hoped that you would. Another part wanted to leave the town and never see that cart again. But you knew there was nowhere easy to go. Even if you survived the sickness, the memory of those streets would remain with you. The next morning, you finally managed to sit up. Your fever had weakened, but your breathing was easier. You looked through the small window and saw the cart standing outside. It was covered with morning frost. For the first time, you did not see it only as a symbol of death. You saw it as the thing that had carried you through years of misery. It had been beside you when nobody else was. And now, as you slowly stood on your feet, you understood that you still had one final journey to make. Whether it would be with the cart or away from it, you did not yet know. A few days later, you were finally strong enough to stand outside your door for more than a few minutes. The fever had passed, but your body still felt weak, as though the sickness had taken something from you that would never completely return. The town looked different from the doorway. The streets were quieter, but not completely silent anymore. A few merchants had begun opening their stalls again. Children appeared in the distance, and smoke rose from chimneys as people slowly returned to ordinary life. It was not the same town you had known before the sickness, but it was beginning to breathe again. Your cart was still waiting outside. The wooden boards were worn, the wheels were damaged, and the handles carried the marks of your hands from countless days of work. You placed your hand against the wood and stood there for a long moment. You had spent so much time trying to escape the thing that had defined your life, yet now you felt strangely connected to it. That cart had carried hundreds of people through the streets. Some had been rich, some poor, some old, some young. Most had been forgotten by everyone except the people who loved them. You had been the final person to carry them away from their homes. You had seen families at their happiest and at their most broken. You had entered houses where nobody else dared to go, and you had walked through streets that others avoided. You had been feared, insulted, and ignored, but you had continued because someone had to do the work. That morning, a messenger arrived at your door. He told you that another person had died. You looked at him, then at the cart. For a moment, you wondered whether you had the strength to do it. Then you slowly took hold of the handles. The cart moved forward with a familiar creak. You pushed it through the streets once again, but this time the town felt strangely different. People still moved aside when they saw you, but some no longer looked away. A woman stood outside her house and quietly thanked you as you passed. An old man nodded. A young boy watched the cart without fear. Perhaps they had finally begun to understand what your work had meant. You were not the cause of death. You were the person who arrived afterward, when everyone else was too frightened or heartbroken to act. At the edge of town, you stopped for a final moment and looked back at the rooftops. The church bells were ringing, the market was beginning to open, and the streets were slowly filling again. Life was returning, even though the scars of the sickness would remain for years. You turned toward the burial grounds and continued walking. The journey was quiet. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd waiting for you, and no monument that would ever carry your name. When you finished, you returned the cart to its place and sat beside it beneath the fading evening light. You had spent your life carrying other people's final moments, yet nobody would probably remember your name. History would remember kings, warriors, merchants, and priests. It would remember battles and castles, victories and disasters. But people like you would almost disappear from the story. Still, without people like you, medieval towns could not have survived their worst days. Someone had to enter the houses. Someone had to lift the dead. Someone had to push the cart through streets where everyone else was afraid to walk. And when the final light disappeared behind the walls of the town, you looked at the old wooden cart one last time and understood the strange truth of your miserable life. You had spent your days carrying the dead, while quietly helping the living continue. Your name may have been forgotten, your work may never have been respected, and your life may never have been written into a grand history book, but for a brief moment, every person you carried had depended on you, and perhaps that was enough.